Today, what we're going to talk about is a bangle that was brought into me by a new customer who had been to several other jewelers and nobody could fix this because the metal thickness of this bangle happens to be approximately zero point 0.2 millimeters thick. It's extremely thin. It happens to also be flexible and it's got big cracks in it. You're going to need something like pitch or a lead block. I like using a lead block because a lead block happens to be a little bit harder and you can rub on this surface a little easier. And then you're going to have to make an indentation in your lead block. But if you need to do that, you'd find a ball punch that happens to be the same contour as that. This is obviously a ball punch I'm going to be using for the inside, so you would need a slightly bigger ball punch to make something like that. You don't want to create excess tarnish on the bangle that would potentially cause you a lot of hassles and cleanup later or that. So I use methylated spirits and boracic acid. It never dissolves 100% in the methylated spirits, but it burns off really quickly and it leaves a very fine film, stopping that tarnish from actually happening. And then it's as easy as literally just lighting it. So put that there. We also don't want to remove too much of the spring tension from the bangle. So you heat it up lightly and then you move over that section where there's the cracks and all the problems. And you heat up just that section there. We are going to lose a bit of spring tension. I intend to tumble it a little bit later. That will give it a bit more of its spring. But these, with their construction, tend to stay pretty springy, even though we've may have annealed it and worked on it. You can now see the extent of the damage a little bit better. And there's a dent there that we're going to push out. And you literally just rub it with a ball punch. Because this is so thin, that's all it needs. That's nice. I'm very happy with that. It's nice and smooth on the inside and the outside. Obviously you can feel a bit of that, but its side profile is starting to look good. Obviously we're going to have to go back in and push again, but we want to solder that now flush. On. Easy flow flux is a powder flux. You literally dip your soldering spike in there, or the back end of your soldering spike, and if you need additional flux you can add it as and when you need it while the item is hot. It's sometimes a bit difficult to add flux in liquid form because your item is now hot and it doesn't like to be cooled down, or that flux tends to bubble quite violently. Now I've cut my little pallions. Some people will put their pallions straight onto their piece. I find that I get a little bit more control like this. I can put the solder exactly where I need it, when I need it. And it's hot, it's not going to dance around. There we go, that's run absolutely beautifully. Exactly where I wanted it to go. I'm not going to need to put a patch by the looks of it, but it may be something I have to add later. You'll notice that solders run quite successfully. Just going to heat up the outer edge and we're going to see if we can get that solder to pull through slightly. There we go. The heat from the top now is helping that metal to pull back. It did pull out a bit when I put the solder on the inside. This is the only problem with this type of thing. Because it's quite tensile and it's got a bit of spring to it, it reacts a little bit differently to normal things when you solder them. So sometimes the metal will pull out or pull in, and you've got to play around with the heat on the bangle in order to manipulate that pull. There's where the repair was done, and I put a bit of extra solder just on the outside surface there because there was a slight indentation, and on the inside there it's a very successful solder. There's no marks or anything really that I'm worried about that could potentially give us trouble. Now, like I said before, it will be easier for us to now rub out any of the dents, but all the dents are pretty much quite high at the moment. They've all pretty much been rubbed out, and you'll notice the bangle still has its spring and it can still twist, so we haven't lost any of that spring. Now what I'm going to be using is a riveting hammer. It's a really small hammer, and the reason for that is that there's very little to be done there to actually push that back in place. So we really don't want to put too much pressure on it. Obviously, if you had a dent in there, you would need to use a smaller ball punch to get in there, and then you use a really tiny ball punch and you hammer that if you've got a high spot there. But this happens to be pretty much central. I'm going to be using a ball phrase just to remove any excess material on the inside there. On the outside you take a fine file and you just remove any excess solder or anything like that. You can do 320, 600, 800, 1000 grit sandpaper. There we go. Problem area solved. Now we need to try and match that texture. What seemed to be a diamond burr texture isn't really a diamond burr texture. It's a little bit too rough. So I'm using an emery wheel. You'll notice now it's extremely difficult to pick up where it was repaired. You're going to see obviously a bit of a difference there now because there's still a bit of tarnish here, even though we used boracic acid to negate that. Now I'm going to be using a wire brush on a spindle, and I'm just going to run over all of this texture with this wire brush. We're going to polish this section up just now. I tend to just like to put a tiny bit of oil or paraffin on there. You'll see I've kept the clip closed because whilst doing the general polishing, you don't want to accidentally hook the bangle in any way and potentially bend it out of shape or anything. The polish I'm using here is known as Tripoli. It's extremely abrasive, so you'll notice it doesn't put a very high shine on anything. It just basically takes out a lot of the scratches. We're going to open up the clip. Now you just got to be careful not to hook that edge. Same on this side. What I tend to like to do is I like to run over the entire bangle with a bit of Tripoli, just to give it a bit of a shine, especially in those engraved lines. You don't have to go overboard, because at the end of the day this is a matte finish bangle, but you want to remove any potential tarnish in any of the grooves. This does a very good job of doing that. The inside of this bangle has a bit of a texture. Where I've repaired it, it's more than likely going to be slightly smoother. It's not going to have that same texture. That texture is put on there by stressing the metal out when they form it. So there's our bangle. We're going to be putting it in our tumbler now. We'll only need to put that on for about 10 minutes. So it's really nice and shiny. But in those grooves there that were bright cut, we can't bright cut them again because this metal's too thin. So if you use a really shiny scalper and you just run the scalper down, you'll burnish all these lines. You can actually see over here from that point to that point, that's where we repaired it, and it's sort of seamless. You can't really see even on the inside. So we've kept that same finish on the inside, and we've kept the same finish on the outside, and you see it's pretty uniform. I've finished the bangle. It still works the way that it's meant to. It's still got structural integrity and spring. You can't see where it's been repaired, and I'm pretty sure that my customer is going to be over the moon with the result. This just happens to be one of many ways that you can repair a bangle like this. I hope that you've learned something new today. Till next time.